If you dare to have that child, I will erase your entire family from this city. 4 years later, in a crowded public park, Chris Morgan, the most powerful CEO in the city, stands frozen. Not because of a rival, not because of a threat, but because standing right in front of him is a little girl with his exact eyes. Zara had never imagined her hands would tremble over something as simple as an envelope. She had held hot plates in a cramped diner kitchen, carried grocery bags up 3 flights of stairs with bruises she didn't talk about, signed lease papers with ink that smelled like fear and hope mixed together. She had survived on stubbornness so long it had become a second heartbeat. But when the thick, cream-colored envelope slid across the polished table toward her, her fingers betrayed her just enough to remind her she was human, just enough to tell her she was standing in front of the kind of man who could turn a life into a rumor with one phone call. It wasn't the money that shook her. It was the man placing it there, as if he were offering a tip, not a sentence. Chris Morgan sat opposite her with the stillness of someone who was never forced to justify himself. The private room in the restaurant was too quiet, insulated from the city's noise like a confession booth built for the rich. The lights were soft, flattering, meant to make deals feel intimate. The table was a dark wood mirror, reflecting their hands, their water glasses, the distance that felt measured and deliberate. Chris didn't reach for his drink. He didn't look around. He didn't even look at her at first. He simply set the envelope down, 2 fingers on its edge, and pushed it forward with a calmness that made Zara's stomach tighten. People said Chris Morgan could sign a contract before breakfast and wipe out hundreds of jobs by lunch without his hand shaking. They said he walked into courtrooms and boardrooms like they belonged to him. Because they did. They said there was no weakness in him, no hesitation, no mercy, no cracks. Sitting across from him, Zara understood why. His face was composed in that expensive way. Not handsome like a movie star, but sharp, like a blade kept clean. His eyes were gray, watchful, and empty of the warmth most people used to pretend they had. The kind of eyes that didn't plead or persuade. They calculated. He spoke without lifting his voice, the words landing like they'd been finalized long before he arrived. Disappear, he said, and consider the child as something that never existed. Zara's breath caught, not because she didn't understand the sentence, but because of how easily he said it, as if she were a minor inconvenience, as if the life inside her was a clerical error that could be corrected with cash and silence. Her fingers closed around the envelope anyway, not to accept it, but to keep herself anchored to the table. It was heavier than she expected, not in weight, but in meaning. Her pulse thudded in her throat, and her mouth tasted faintly of metal, the way it always did when fear rose too fast. For a moment, she said nothing. She stared at the envelope as if it might open itself and explain how a man could be so cold about something so irreversible. Then she let out a small, humorless laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't brave. It was the sound of someone realizing there was no script for this kind of cruelty. The smile that curved her lips didn't reach her eyes. The innocence had been burned out of her long ago. "And if I don't?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them, thin as a wire. Chris finally looked at her. Not with anger, not with shock. There was no flare of emotion at all. Only the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no and never been made to pay for the things he wanted. His gaze traveled to her face, then down briefly, clinically to the slight curve of her abdomen, and back up again, as if he were checking a fact he already knew. "Then I will break your family," he said, one by one. The words were delivered as calmly as a schedule. No raised voice, no dramatic threat. He didn't need theatrics. Men like Chris Morgan didn't threaten because they were desperate. They threatened because they were capable. Zara felt the room tilt, not physically, but in the way her sense of safety shifted, as if someone had kicked out the last supporting beam. She pictured her mother's small apartment, the way her mother's hands looked when she kneaded dough to calm herself, the way her younger brother still slept with a light on because darkness made his anxiety loud. She pictured them as targets, not people. That was the moment she knew this wasn't a cruel line tossed in anger, something he might regret later. This was policy. He wasn't bluffing. He was informing her. Her throat tightened, and she forced air into her lungs slowly so he wouldn't see her panic. Zara had learned a long time ago that fear was blood in the water. People like him could smell it. She placed the envelope back on the table between them with deliberate care, as if it were something fragile and poisonous. "Keep it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not for sale." Chris's expression didn't change. Not a twitch. Not even contempt. Just that unbearable neutrality. As though her defiance had been predicted and filed away. "Think about it," he said, like he was giving her a generous offer rather than an ultimatum. Zara rose to her feet. The chair legs whispered against the floor. She was aware of her posture, of every movement, as if she were walking along the edge of a cliff, and any stumble would send her tumbling. She forced herself not to glance at the door like a frightened animal. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She gathered her bag, slid the strap over her shoulder, and met his eyes one last time. "I will," she lied, because sometimes lying was the only way to survive a room with a predator. She turned and walked out. The hallway outside the private room smelled like expensive perfume and roasted meat, the kind of place where other people's celebrations lived. Zara's heels clicked against the marble like a countdown. Her body wanted to run. She didn't. She kept her pace measured, her back straight, even as her heart hammered and her skin prickled with the sense that someone was watching her from behind. When she reached the restaurant's main floor, the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses washed over her. For a second, she could almost pretend she was just another woman leaving dinner early. But the moment she stepped outside into the night air, the illusion shattered. The city was bright, loud, indifferent. Headlights streaked past. People laughed on the sidewalk. Somewhere, a siren wailed, and then faded, like a warning meant for someone else. Zara walked 2 blocks before she let herself breathe out fully. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed a palm to her stomach, an unconscious protective gesture, and whispered words she didn't know if she believed yet. "I'm here." She got into her old car, sat with her forehead resting against the steering wheel for 3 long seconds, then started the engine. The drive to her apartment felt unreal, like she was moving through a scene that had been rehearsed by someone who hated her. Every red light made her jump. Every shadow at the edge of her mirrors felt like a vehicle following. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself fear was making everything look like a threat. But fear, she had learned, was sometimes just the body recognizing danger before the mind wanted to admit it. By the time she reached her building, her palms were damp on the steering wheel. She parked and sat for a moment, scanning the street, Nothing obvious. No men leaning against walls. No dark sedan idling at the curb. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Tired, crowded, alive. She forced herself to step out. Her apartment was on the second floor. Down a narrow corridor that always smelled faintly of detergent and someone's burnt toast. She climbed the stairs slowly, keys in hand, ready to unlock her door and slide inside and pretend she could shut the world out. The hallway was dim. One of the ceiling lights flickered. Her door stood at the end. Familiar. Chipped paint around the lock, where her landlord had once promised to fix it. Zara approached. Her steps soundless now. She lifted her key, and then she heard it. A dry, ugly sound behind the door, like metal being forced where it didn't belong. A scrape. A twist. Then sharp and final crack. Zara froze. Her breath stopped. The key trembled between her fingers. The sound wasn't loud, but it was intimate, as if someone were breaking into her life with their hands. Her blood went cold. The lock clicked again, the mechanism surrendering. Zara didn't scream. She didn't rush forward. She stepped back, one foot sliding silently, her body moving on instinct while her mind struggled to catch up. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it felt like pain. The door shifted inward slightly, just a fraction. Then it opened. A man stepped out like he belonged there, late 20s, unshaven. Eyes too bright, with the restless hunger of someone who always needed more money, more thrills, more power over someone else. His clothes were expensive in a careless way, the collar open, a watch on his wrist that didn't match the building. His smile was the worst part. Too easy, too familiar. Like he'd done this before and expected it to work. He looked at Zara the way men looked when they thought fear would make a woman obedient. "Zara," he said, almost pleasantly, as if they were old friends meeting by accident. She couldn't speak. Her throat was locked tight. The man's gaze slid down to her stomach and back up. Amused. "Chris said you might need a little convincing." The name hit her like a slap. Chris. Of course. Zara's fingers dug into her bag strap until the leather bit her skin. She took another step back, measuring distance, calculating exits. The stairwell behind her, the neighbor's door halfway down the hall, the metal railing she could use as a weapon if she had to. The man. Dominic, she realized. Because she'd heard Chris's family name in whispered gossip, tilted his head, smiling wider, enjoying her silence. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." He paused, letting the lie breathe, then added softly, "Unless you make me." Zara's stomach tightened around the baby like a protective fist. She forced her voice out through the panic. "Get away from my door." Dominic chuckled, as if she'd made a joke. "Sweetheart," he said, stepping closer. "It's not your door anymore. Not when you're carrying something that belongs to my cousin." The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, the air too thick. Zara's mind raced through everything she could do, everything she should have done. Call the police, scream for help, run. But fear had a peculiar cruelty. It made time stretch and compress at once, trapping you inside a moment while the world kept moving around you. Dominic took another step, and Zara's back brushed the cold wall. She could smell his cologne, sharp and expensive, layered over something sour beneath. His hand lifted, not touching her yet, but close enough that her skin prickled as if it anticipated pain. "You should have taken the money," he murmured. "Would have been easier for everyone." Zara met his eyes, and in that second she understood with crystal clarity. Chris Morgan hadn't just told her to disappear. He had set a trap. He had sent violence into her life, as casually as he had pushed an envelope across a table. And the worst part was not the fear clawing at her chest. The worst part was the dawning realization that this moment, this hallway, this lock breaking under someone else's hand, this was only the beginning. Zara once believed that leaving the city would end everything, that distance could function like erasure, that miles and silence could bury fear the way dirt buries a body. 4 years earlier, she had walked away in the middle of the night with her hands wrapped protectively around her pregnant stomach, the streets slick with rain and neon, her breath fogging the air as if the city itself were exhaling her out. She hadn't packed much. A change of clothes, documents, a few photographs folded until the edges softened. What she carried with her wasn't money or certainty or a plan. It was memory. The sound of a lock breaking. The look in a man's eyes when he believed fear gave him ownership. The calm voice of Chris Morgan delivering a threat-like policy. That memory traveled with her, settled into her bones, and refused to let her rest. It was the reason she worked twice as hard when her body begged her to slow down. It was the reason she studied 3 times as much when her eyes burned from exhaustion. It was the reason she slept less than anyone around her, waking at the smallest noise. Her hand instinctively moving to her belly and later to the small, warm weight of her daughter beside her. None of it was about proving anything to Chris Morgan. He was a ghost she refused to name aloud. This was about one thing only: making sure no one would ever threaten her child again. Fear became her fuel, and discipline became her shield. The years that followed did not unfold gently. They arrived sharp and demanding, each one asking more of her than the last. There were moments she nearly broke nights when Sienna cried from colic and Zara cried silently with her. Mornings when she stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman with shadows under her eyes and resolve carved too deep into her face. But she kept going, not because she believed she was strong, but because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The first turning point came quietly, disguised as a choice no one else seemed to understand. Zara was offered assistance money that came with polite smiles and invisible strings, the kind meant to keep her grateful and small. She declined it. Instead, she accepted a position at a struggling startup operating out of a converted warehouse, where exposed brick and flickering lights replaced comfort and security. On her first day, she stood in front of a group of founders who didn't care about her past or her fear. They interrupted her, questioned her numbers, challenged her assumptions. She learned quickly that respect there was not given. It was extracted through clarity and preparation. She refined her ideas late into the night, revising projections with one hand while rocking Sienna with the other. She spoke again and again until her voice stopped shaking, until her arguments landed clean and sharp. In that room, there was no mercy, but there was honesty. And honesty, she discovered, was something she could build on. The second turning point demanded everything she had saved, every dollar carefully set aside, every sacrifice justified by the promise of someday. The project was risky, ambitious to the point of recklessness, and nearly everyone told her so. Advisors warned her. Friends hesitated. Even the version of herself that woke at 3 in the morning whispered doubts she didn't want to hear. But Zara recognized the feeling twisting in her chest. It was the same one she had felt 4 years ago, standing in a hallway with her back against a wall, realizing that safety was never handed to you. It was taken. She invested anyway. The months that followed were brutal. Delays, setbacks, moments when she wondered if fear had finally made her reckless instead of careful. Then, slowly, the tide turned. Data aligned. Demand surged. What others had dismissed as excessive proved necessary. What they had called impossible became inevitable. When the results came in, undeniable and public, Zara didn't celebrate. She sat alone at her kitchen table long after Sienna had fallen asleep, staring at the numbers until they blurred. Relief arrived first, heavy and almost painful. Then something quieter followed. Confidence, not loud, not arrogant, just steady. The third turning point came late one evening, after the city outside her window had dimmed to a constellation of scattered lights. Zara sat in front of her laptop, the room silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. The contract glowed on the screen, pages dense with language she now understood intimately. She read every line twice, then once more, not because she doubted it, but because she needed to feel the weight of it settle fully. Her name appeared where it mattered. The signatures followed. When she clicked to finalize the purchase, the confirmation loaded slowly, as if the system itself were pausing to acknowledge what had just happened. Then the name appeared at the top of the page. The parent company, Chris Morgan's company. Zara stared at it for a long time. She didn't smile. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of revenge fulfilled, only a strange stillness, like the moment after a storm when the air feels scrubbed raw. She thought of the woman she had been 4 years earlier, gripping a steering wheel with shaking hands, wondering if survival would be enough. She thought of the nights spent studying while her daughter slept curled against her side, unaware of the war being fought quietly around her. Zara closed the laptop slowly. In the reflection of the dark screen, her face looked older, harder, but unbroken. She whispered the words without anger, without joy, just truth. My turn. In that moment, something inside her shifted into place. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She was choosing her direction and stepping into it with open eyes. Zara didn't seek confrontation for its own sake. She didn't crave dominance or validation. But she understood now that retreat had only ever delayed the inevitable. Power, once noticed, could not be ignored. And fear, once confronted, lost its teeth. By buying her way into Chris Morgan's world, Zara wasn't inviting a war. She was ending a long one on her own terms. She had crossed the line she once swore she never would. Not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. The city she fled no longer belonged to her past alone. It was part of her future. And this time, she would not be the one standing with her back against the wall. Chris Morgan did not sleep that night. The city outside his penthouse window glowed with its usual arrogance lights, stretching endlessly. Traffic moving like veins that never rested, but none of it reached him. The reports spread across his desk had nothing to do with markets, acquisitions, or quarterly projections. They were about one woman, Zara. 4 years of data, compressed into clean pages and bullet points that should have reassured him. No scandals, no financial desperation, no attempts to contact him, no requests, no leverage plays. She had vanished from his orbit completely, and that absence unsettled him more than any direct challenge ever had. Chris was accustomed to resistance. He understood enemies, rivals, lawsuits, hostile takeovers. Those were predictable. What he did not understand was silence chosen freely. A woman who had been threatened, cornered, and then simply built a life without circling back to him. That kind of independence didn't fit the narratives he controlled. By morning, he had agreed to the meeting not because he wanted answers, but because he needed to reassert gravity. The hotel was one of his discreet, expensive, designed for negotiations that preferred glass walls and confidentiality over warmth. The meeting room sat high above the street, encased in transparent panels that made the city feel distant and unreal. Cold white light reflected off the table, flattening shadows and emotions alike. Zara arrived first. She stood near the window, hands relaxed at her sides, her posture calm in a way that spoke of preparation rather than ease. When Chris entered moments later, their eyes met briefly, then disengaged. There was no greeting, no polite pretense of familiarity. He took his seat across from her, placing his phone face down on the table, as if to signal that nothing outside this room required his attention. He wasted no time. "What do you want?" The question was direct, almost bored, as though he expected a list he could dismiss or negotiate down. Zara didn't flinch. She opened her laptop with deliberate movements, the soft click of the hinge loud in the quiet room. From her bag, she took out a thin folder and slid it across the table toward him. "Fairness," she said. Chris let out a soft chuckle. It was a sound many people recognized, one that had ended arguments before they began. A smile curved his lips, faint and controlled, the kind that once made opponents doubt themselves. He reached for the folder casually. Then his eyes dropped to the first line. The smile disappeared. Complaint of assault named Dominic Morgan. Chris's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the edge of the paper. He read on. Slower now. Medical records. Dated photographs. Old witness statements that had never reached court. Timelines that overlapped too precisely to dismiss. There was nothing sensational here. No dramatic accusations meant to provoke outrage. Just documentation. Quiet, thorough, uncomfortable. Zara watched him without satisfaction or triumph. When she spoke, her voice was level, almost gentle. "You didn't do it yourself," she said, "but you opened the door." The words landed harder than any accusation. She wasn't blaming him for the violence directly. She was holding him responsible for the power that enabled it, for the environment he had cultivated, where people like Dominic felt protected by association. Chris closed the folder slowly. The room felt smaller now, the glass walls no longer offering distance, but exposure. His voice, when he spoke, was lower, stripped of its earlier detachment. "What do you want me to do?" It was a question he rarely asked without conditions attached. Zara stood. The chair slid back quietly. She moved closer to the table, close enough that only a single step separated them. Chris noticed details he hadn't expected to the steadiness of her breathing, the absence of fear in her eyes. This was not the woman he had threatened years ago. This was someone who had already survived him. "Nothing," she said. "You've lost the right to decide." For a brief moment, Chris felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not anger, not guilt, displacement. He had built his life around control of outcomes, of people, of narratives. And now, sitting in a room he owned, across from a woman who had entered his world without asking permission, he realized control was no longer the currency here. Zara turned away without waiting for his response. She closed her laptop, gathered her things, and walked toward the door. The sound of her footsteps was soft but final, each one widening the distance between them. Chris remained seated. He stared at the closed folder on the table as if it might explain what he had just lost. For the first time in his adult life, power did not present itself as a solution. Money couldn't erase the past laid out in that file. Influence couldn't force her back into negotiation. Threats would only confirm what she already knew. As the door clicked shut behind Zara, Chris exhaled slowly. The city beyond the glass looked the same as it always had, vast, obedient, ready to bend. But something fundamental had shifted. This was not a battle that could be won with leverage or intimidation. This was a reckoning that demanded something he had never been asked to give before. And for the first time, Chris Morgan did not know what to do with his power. Chris Morgan did not follow Zara. That would have felt too obvious, too much like the old habits he was trying and failing to shed. Instead, he followed the child. The decision settled in him quietly, without justification or strategy, as if something older than reason had taken over. The preschool sat on a quiet street lined with trees just beginning to lose their leaves. The kind of place designed to feel safe. At 4 in the afternoon, parents gathered in loose clusters near the gate, checking phones, talking about schedules, waiting with the mild impatience of people whose lives were anchored elsewhere. Chris stood across the street, hands in the pockets of a plain dark coat, no tailored suit, no driver idling nearby, no entourage buffering the world away from him. For once, he was simply another man standing still, trying not to be noticed. He told himself he was only observing, that this was about certainty, about confirming what his mind already knew. But when the gate opened and children spilled out into the sunlight, all his practiced rationalizations dissolved. Sienna ran ahead of the others, her backpack bouncing awkwardly against her small frame. She stumbled over her own feet, caught herself with clumsy grace, then laughed a bright, unguarded sound that cut straight through him. Chris's chest tightened sharply, as if something had seized his heart without warning. That laugh wasn't polite or careful. It wasn't learned. It was instinctive joy, the kind that existed before fear. He watched her straighten, brush dirt from her knees the way children did, with more confidence than caution. Every movement felt familiar in ways he couldn't explain. The tilt of her head, the way she scanned the crowd, searching. Zara appeared moments later, stepping through the gate with unhurried ease. She crouched in front of Sienna, wiping her hands clean, adjusting the strap of her backpack, murmuring something that made the child nod solemnly. Chris felt an ache settle deep in his bones. This was a world he had never been part of, unfolding daily without him, without permission, without consequence. Until now. Without thinking, he took a step forward. Just one. A reflex. Really. The distance between them narrowed by a fraction, and with it came a surge of something dangerously close to hope. Then a forearm appeared in his path, firm, unyielding. A school security guard stood between him and the gate, posture alert, but not aggressive. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said evenly. "You're not allowed to approach." Chris froze. The words didn't register at first. He was used to being waved through barriers, not stopped by them. Used to doors opening before he reached them. He glanced down, almost expecting the man to recognize him, to apologize. Instead, another man stepped forward and held out a document. Legal paper. Official. Final. Temporary restraining order. Chris stared at the words, his mind slow to catch up. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something he could override with a phone call. He looked up just as Zara lifted her gaze. She had seen him. There was no shock on her face, no flicker of panic. Only calm. Not coldness, something more deliberate. An acknowledgement. Perhaps. As if she had anticipated this moment and prepared herself for it long ago. Their eyes met across the short distance, and in that silent exchange, Zara communicated exactly one thing. This is the line. She took Sienna's hand, gently, firmly, and turned away. No hesitation, no backward glance. They walked down the sidewalk together, blending into the flow of people, mother and child moving as one. Chris remained where he was, surrounded by strangers who had no idea who he was or what he had lost. Around him, parents laughed, checked watches, complained about traffic. Life continued, indifferent to his internal collapse. For the first time, the city did not bend to his presence. He stood there long after Zara and Sienna disappeared from view, the paper heavy in his hand. The guard shifted his weight, watching him with quiet vigilance. But Chris barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, caught on the image of a little girl, laughing after she fell, unafraid of the ground beneath her. He had spent his life believing that power could fix anything, that money could buy access, forgiveness, time. But standing on that sidewalk, barred by law and choice, he understood something with devastating clarity. There were things no amount of influence could purchase. No deal could reopen that gate. No threat could bridge the space Zara had drawn so cleanly between them. He had lost something fundamental, something he had never known he wanted until it was placed beyond his reach. The right to step forward, the right to be seen, the right to call himself a father. Chris Morgan, the man who had once made an entire city lower its eyes, stood rooted among ordinary people, unable to move even a single step toward his own child. Zara had won. At least, that was how it looked on paper. The contracts were signed, the board had shifted, and control now sat firmly in her hands. Chris Morgan had been pushed to the margins of the empire he once commanded, with unquestioned authority. Dominic had vanished from the city, his name erased from polite conversation, his presence reduced to a shadow that no longer hovered over her door. The system had done what systems were designed to do when pressed hard enough. It had bent. From the outside, it was a clean victory, efficient and final. Zara told herself this was what safety looked like. She told herself that power was protection, that numbers and legal language could stand between her daughter and the kind of fear that once stalked their nights. But there was one thing she could not command: no matter how carefully she planned or how decisively she acted. Sienna. The change came quietly, so gradually that Zara nearly missed it. Her daughter stopped racing ahead when they walked together, no longer tugging Zara forward with impatient excitement. She sat longer at the table, tracing patterns in the wood with her fingers, instead of chattering about her day. The questions that once spilled out of her about clouds and strangers, and why some people looked sad, faded into silence. Zara noticed these things in fragments, dismissed them as phases, growing pains, the inevitable calm that followed early childhood exuberance. She told herself Sienna was simply maturing. But some part of her knew better. Children did not lose their light without reason. One evening, the apartment glowed with the muted warmth of lamplight, shadows stretching softly across the floor. Zara sat at the dining table, laptop open, documents layered across the screen like an unfolding map of obligations. The call with the European partners had already been rescheduled twice. This meeting could not move again. The contract represented months of work, the kind of opportunity that secured stability, not just for the present, but for years to come. Zara adjusted her headset, fingers flying across the keyboard as she reviewed talking points. Her mind split neatly between strategy and execution. She barely heard the soft footsteps behind her. A small hand tugged at her sleeve. Zara looked down to see Sienna, standing there in pajamas. Her stuffed bear clutched tightly against her chest. Her eyes were wide, hopeful, carrying a vulnerability that made Zara's chest ache before she understood why. "Mom," Sienna said quietly, "are you coming to watch me perform?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Zara glanced at the clock automatically, the way she always did now. The time glared back at her, unforgiving. In 20 minutes, the meeting would begin. The most important deal of the quarter. The kind of moment she had built her life toward. She felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the mental calculations racing ahead of emotion. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said gently. "Maybe next time." "Okay." Sienna nodded. No tears, no protest. Just a small, careful movement of her head, as if she had anticipated the answer and prepared herself for it. She hugged her bear a little closer and turned toward the hallway. Zara watched her walk away, something cold settling just beneath her ribs. The bedroom door closed with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. The sound lingered in the room, filling the space where Sienna's voice had been. Zara removed her headset and sat still, staring at the closed door. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of her victory cracked. She saw it clearly then. The truth she had been avoiding. She had spent 4 years running from fear-building walls, accumulating power, making herself untouchable in ways she had once believed impossible. And in doing so, she might have been creating a different kind of absence, one that money could not fix and authority could not mend. Zara thought back to the nights she had rocked Sienna to sleep while studying contracts, to the mornings she had left before dawn to attend meetings that promised security. Every sacrifice had been made in love, justified by the belief that safety was the ultimate gift. But safety without presence, without attention, without shared moments, what was it worth? The realization hurt more than any threat ever had, because this was not an enemy she could confront or defeat. This was a consequence. Zara stood and walked quietly to Sienna's door. She paused with her hand on the handle, listening to the soft rhythm of her daughter's breathing. Inside, Sienna lay curled on her side, bare tucked beneath her chin, eyes open and staring at the wall. Zara stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. She brushed a strand of hair from Sienna's face, her touch light, almost hesitant. Sienna didn't turn toward her, but she didn't pull away either. Zara wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, wanted to promise she would do better. But promises felt dangerous now, too easily broken by necessity and ambition. Instead, she stayed there, silent, her hand resting gently on the bed, grounding herself in the reality she could no longer ignore. When she returned to the living room, the meeting reminder flashed insistently on her screen. Zara stared at it, then at the closed bedroom door. For the first time since she had seized control of her circumstances, she hesitated. The victory she had fought so hard for suddenly felt incomplete, its edges sharp and costly. Revenge had been accomplished, justice served in its own way, but the price was beginning to reveal itself, not in headlines or legal briefs, but in the quiet withdrawal of a child who was learning, too early, that love sometimes came second to obligation. Zara closed the laptop slowly. She knew now that the war she thought she had finished was not over. It had simply changed shape. Chris Morgan did not look for Zara. He didn't call, didn't send intermediaries, didn't try to force another meeting under the weight of regret or explanation. He stayed where he was, contained by law and consequence. But Luna Morgan did not believe in waiting. One quiet morning, Zara walked into a conference room she now legally controlled and found a woman already seated at the table, hands folded, posture immaculate, presence absolute. Luna Morgan sat with her back straight and her gaze sharp, the kind of calm that felt earned through decades of never being overruled. This was the woman who had built the empire before Chris inherited it, the architect behind the reputation, the strategist who had survived markets, men, and mistakes without ever allowing them to mark her publicly. Luna looked at Zara as if she were measuring something more than a business opponent. "Do you think you've won?" she asked softly. There was no hostility in her tone, but no warmth either. Zara took her seat without hesitation, without lowering her eyes. "I didn't come here to win," she replied. "I came to end it." Luna smiled then, a slow curve of her lips that carried no humor. It was the smile of someone who had watched countless people mistake momentum for permanence. "Do you have any idea how much Chris has lost because of you?" she asked. "His reputation, his authority, his family?" Zara met her gaze steadily. "He took more from me than that," she said. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls themselves were listening. Luna studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Then she stood, smoothing the sleeve of her coat with practiced elegance. "You may have taken the company," Luna said, "but you can't erase the truth." She walked toward the door, heels clicking softly against the floor. Just before leaving, she stopped. "That child," she said without turning around. "She has heart trouble, doesn't she?" Zara rose so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. "What did you say?" Luna did not look back. "The Morgan family," she continued calmly, "has a history of congenital heart disease." The door closed behind her. The sound echoed too loudly in the silent room. Zara stood frozen, her mind raced, pulling fragments together with terrifying clarity. Sienna's unexplained fatigue. The moments when she pressed a hand to her chest and said nothing. The medical appointments that ended with careful phrases and suggestions to monitor rather than diagnose. The way Zara had convinced herself that vigilance was enough, that fear had been defeated. By the time evening fell, Zara's composure was already fraying. She tried to distract herself with routine dinner, homework, gentle conversation, but she watched Sienna constantly, noting every breath, every pause. When Sienna complained of feeling dizzy and sat down suddenly, Zara's heart lurched. Moments later, her daughter collapsed. The world narrowed to sound and motion. Zara's voice calling Sienna's name, the floor rushing up, her hands shaking as she lifted her child. Terror clawing through every barrier she had built. At the hospital, time lost meaning. Doctors moved quickly, efficiently, speaking in measured tones that did nothing to calm the storm inside her. Zara stood alone in the corridor, her reflection faint in the glass, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Her phone felt heavy in her hand. She stared at the screen, at the name she had sworn she would never touch again. Chris Morgan. She had promised herself she would never ask him for anything, never need him, never give him another inch of access to her life or her child. But the promise dissolved under the weight of reality. Pride had no place here. Fear had returned, sharper and more honest than before. With trembling fingers, Zara pressed call. When Chris answered, there was no hesitation in his voice, only urgency. "Where is she?" he asked. Zara closed her eyes. "At the hospital," she said. "They think it's her heart." There was a pause, brief, controlled, but she could hear the shift in his breathing. "I'm coming," he said. The line went dead. Zara sank into a chair, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. She understood now what Luna had meant. Power could be taken. Companies could be controlled. But truth moved quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. And now, with her daughter's life hanging in the balance, Zara had crossed the one line she never intended to cross again. She had called the man she once fled from. The war she thought she had ended had only entered its most dangerous phase. Zara could not remember how she had driven to the hospital. The streets blurred into streaks of light and shadow, traffic signals registering only as colors without meaning. What she remembered instead was the sound of Sienna's breathing behind her short, uneven gasps that scraped against Zara's nerves, and the moment when that sound faded into something terrifyingly quiet. She remembered calling her daughter's name again and again, her voice growing louder, as if volume alone could pull Sienna back. She remembered the way cold spread through her chest when there was no answer. By the time the car skidded into the hospital parking lot, fear had stripped everything else away. The emergency room was awash of white light and controlled chaos. Doors burst open, wheels squeaked, voices overlapped in urgent fragments. Zara ran barefoot across the floor, one shoe lost somewhere behind her. Her arms locked around Sienna's limp body as nurses rushed forward to take her. The weight leaving her arms felt wrong, like a piece of her had been torn away. Doctors spoke quickly, efficiently, their words clipped and precise. But Zara caught only pieces: heart rate, oxygen, stabilize. She stood frozen as they moved her daughter onto a gurney, wires and hands surrounding Sienna's small frame. The world narrowed to a single point when a doctor turned to her. "We need to know the paternal family's cardiac history," he said. Zara stopped breathing. Her fingers tightened around her phone until the edges dug into her palm. On the screen, the name she had sworn never to touch again glowed back at her. Chris Morgan. She had built her life around the promise that she would never need him, never call him, never hand him another piece of herself or her child. But standing under the fluorescent lights of the emergency room, pride felt obscene. It had no place here. Fear swallowed everything else. Zara pressed the call button. Chris answered immediately. No greeting, no hesitation. Just one question, sharp and stripped of pretense. "Where is she?" Zara's voice came out raw. "The hospital," she said. "They think it's her heart." There was a pause, brief, contained, but she heard it, the shift in his breath. "I'm coming," he said. The line went dead. Zara slid down into a chair as nurses rushed past her, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to keep from shaking apart. 15 minutes later, Chris Morgan appeared, not in a suit, not flanked by assistants or guards. Just a man who had run, his coat unbuttoned, his hair out of place, his chest rising and falling too fast. He stopped short when he saw Sienna through the glass, lying motionless on the bed, tubes and wires crisscrossing her small body, the color drained from his face. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply stood there, staring, as if approaching her might break something irreparable. Zara watched him from a distance, surprised by the absence of triumph, of bitterness. There was no satisfaction in seeing him stripped of his composure, only a shared terror that eclipsed everything else. Chris took a step closer, then stopped again. He didn't reach out. He didn't touch Sienna. His hands curled into fists at his sides, as if he were afraid of what they might do if allowed to move. Finally, he turned to Zara. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. There were no words polished enough for this moment. "I'm here," he said. And for the first time, Zara believed him. The doctors moved swiftly, their decisions unfolding with grim inevitability. Surgery was necessary. Immediately, consent forms appeared. Explanations were given in calm, professional tones that did nothing to soften the terror behind them. Zara signed where they told her to sign, her name barely legible, her vision blurred by tears she didn't remember shedding. Chris stood beside her, silent, absorbing information with a focus that felt almost painful to witness. When they wheeled Sienna toward the operating room, Zara reached out instinctively. Chris did the same. Their hands brushed, then stopped, hovering uncertainly in the space between them. Sienna was taken through doors that closed with a final, unforgiving sound. The hallway beyond was empty, the air humming softly with machinery and distant footsteps. Time lost its shape. Zara and Chris sat side by side without touching, a careful distance maintained by habit and history. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into something heavy and oppressive. The hum of the ventilation system filled the silence, relentless and indifferent. Zara stared at the floor, replaying every moment she might have missed, every sign she had dismissed. Guilt pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. Chris stared straight ahead, his jaw set. his eyes unblinking. For the first time in his life, there was no lever to pull, no call to make, no resource to deploy that could change the outcome unfolding behind those doors. Power had abandoned him completely. All that remained was the fear of losing something irreplaceable. Hours passed, or minutes. Zara couldn't tell. At some point, exhaustion crept in, heavy and unwelcome. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a second, only to jolt awake at the sound of a door opening. A surgeon approached, removing his mask slowly. Zara stood before she realized she was moving. Chris rose beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow, unsure whether he was allowed to steady her. The surgery was difficult, the doctor said carefully. Zara's heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the rest. But she's stable. She'll need ongoing care, monitoring. This isn't over. Relief crashed through Zara with such force her knees weakened. She nodded, unable to form words. Chris exhaled shakily. One hand braced against the wall, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. They were allowed to see Sienna briefly. She lay small and pale in the recovery room, machines keeping careful watch over every beat of her heart. Zara stood at her bedside, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Chris stood on the other side, still not touching, his gaze fixed on his daughter, with an expression that bordered on reverence and terror. In that sterile room, under the soft beeping of monitors, something fundamental shifted. The war that had defined their relationship fell away, rendered meaningless by the fragile rise and fall of a child's chest. Chris Morgan, a man who had bent cities to his will, stood powerless before a hospital bed, and Zara, who had fought so hard to protect herself from him, understood that whatever came next would be shaped not by control or revenge, but by the simple, devastating truth of love and fear intertwined. Sienna survived the night. The doctors used careful words when they delivered the update, phrases designed to balance relief with reality. She was stable, they said, out of immediate danger. But she would need long-term monitoring, follow-ups, adjustments. There were no promises offered, no certainty extended like a lifeline. Only vigilance, only time. Zara accepted the information with quiet nods, her body too exhausted to react properly, her emotions stretched thin and fragile. When the doctors left, she returned to Sienna's bedside and stayed there, holding her daughter's hand as if letting go might invite disaster back in. Chris did not follow her inside. Instead, he sat alone in the hallway outside the ward, the sterile light washing over him without mercy. The hospital had a way of stripping people down to their simplest forms. Here, he was not a CEO or a name whispered with fear or respect. He was just a man sitting on a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if answers might appear between the tiles. The events of the night replayed relentlessly in his mind, the sound of Zara's voice on the phone, tight with terror, the sight of Sienna's small body surrounded by machines, the feeling of standing helpless while strangers worked to save what mattered more than anything he had ever owned. For the first time, the weight of his past decisions pressed down without the buffer of distance or denial. He did not reach for his phone out of habit. He had already made the call. Dominic arrived an hour later. He didn't wear a hospital badge, didn't belong in this place of quiet urgency and restrained hope. His presence felt like a contamination, He walked down the corridor with casual confidence, hands in his pockets, eyes sharp and calculating. The smirk on his face was familiar, a reflection of the man he had always been, someone who thrived on other people's discomfort. The nurses glanced at him, uneasy but silent. Chris stood as Dominic approached. The two men faced each other beneath the fluorescent lights. The distance between them charged but contained. There was no shouting, no threats, no raised fists. Dominic broke the silence first, his voice low and amused. "You think saying sorry fixes this?" he asked. Chris didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. He looked directly at Dominic, his gaze steady in a way that made even Dominic hesitate. "No," Chris said, "but I'm done running." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, thicker than the one Zara had slid across the hotel table days earlier. He handed it over without ceremony. "That's everything," Chris continued. "Statements, evidence, my part in it. I'll take whatever comes." Dominic flipped through the pages slowly, his expression shifting from smugness to something closer to unease. "You're serious," he said. Chris nodded once. "But you won't touch them again," he added. "Ever." Dominic laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "You don't get to make demands anymore." Chris met his eyes. "No," he agreed. "I don't." That admission landed harder than any threat. Dominic closed the folder. For the first time since he'd arrived, he had nothing clever to say. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then Chris stepped past him. No final warning, no dramatic exit. He didn't look back. Whatever Dominic chose to do next was no longer something Chris could or would control. Responsibility, he was learning, meant accepting consequences without bargaining. When Chris returned to Sienna's room, the lights were dimmed. The steady beep of the monitor was softer now, almost rhythmic, a fragile reassurance. Zara sat slumped in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted awkwardly, exhaustion finally claiming her. One hand still held Sienna's, fingers wrapped protectively around the small, warm palm. Chris stopped just inside the doorway. He watched them for a long time, taking in the details he had missed before the way Zara's hair had come loose from its neat restraint. The faint crease between her brows, even in sleep. The trust implicit in her posture. She hadn't moved from that spot. She hadn't left her daughter alone for even a moment. Guilt rose again, sharp and insistent. Not the kind that demanded forgiveness, but the kind that required action. Chris approached quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile peace of the room. He did not touch Zara, did not wake her. He reached for the blanket folded at the foot of the bed and gently pulled it up, covering both mother and child. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it felt heavier than any deal he had ever closed. He stood there afterward, hands at his sides, unsure what to do next. This was not a moment that could be redeemed with words. There was nothing he could say that would make the past disappear or soften its edges. He understood now that some things could not be erased. They could only be acknowledged and carried forward. Chris took a seat on the other side of the bed, keeping his distance, his presence unobtrusive. He watched Sienna's chest rise and fall, each breath a quiet victory. Zara stirred slightly but did not wake, her grip tightening unconsciously around her daughter's hand. Chris stayed where he was. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not hope for reconciliation. He chose something harder instead. He chose to remain, to face what came next, without hiding behind power or privilege. To accept that being a father, if he was ever allowed to be one, would mean accountability without guarantees. In the soft light of the hospital room, surrounded by machines that measured life in numbers and beeps, Chris Morgan made a decision that would define him more than any empire ever had. He would stop trying to be absolved. He would take responsibility, and whatever the cost, he would not look away again. A few months later, the city had softened around the edges. Winter had loosened its grip, leaving behind an afternoon washed in pale sunlight and gentle warmth. The old park looked much the same as it always had: wide paths, familiar benches, trees casting patient shadows across the grass. But something in the air felt quieter, less charged. Time had passed, not enough to erase what had happened, but enough to let the sharpest edges dull. Sienna ran ahead, her sneakers kicking up small bursts of dust, her laughter ringing clear and unguarded. It was lighter now, that laugh. Not careless, perhaps, but no longer fragile. It carried confidence, the kind that returned slowly after fear learned it no longer needed to be on constant watch. Zara stood a few steps behind, her pace unhurried. She watched her daughter with an attention that no longer competed with screens or schedules. Nearby, Chris stood at a respectful distance, close enough to be present, far enough not to intrude. Neither of them crossed the invisible line they had learned to honor. They existed in parallel, aware of one another, choosing restraint over impulse. The afternoon stretched quietly, the world continuing without commentary. Sienna slowed and turned, her eyes scanning the space between them as if measuring something invisible. Then she smiled, bright and decisive. "Mom, Dad, come play with me." The words hung there, simple and enormous. Zara's breath caught. Not in fear this time, but in surprise. She looked at Chris. It was only a second, barely enough to register, but it carried the weight of everything they had survived. No demands passed between them. No negotiation, just acknowledgement. Zara nodded. The smallest movement, permission, not surrender. They stepped forward together, closing the space by choice. There was no rush to touch, no instinct to claim. They stood side by side, watching Sienna crouch to examine something in the grass, as if she were discovering the world anew. For a moment, they shared the same view, the same quiet focus, the same unspoken understanding that this ordinariness was something precious. Chris knelt to Sienna's level, careful, deliberate. He had learned that sudden movements frightened her now, not outwardly, but in ways only parents noticed. He waited until she looked at him. "I won't disappear anymore," he said softly. The words were steady, not rehearsed. "But you don't have to call me that if you're not ready." Sienna considered this seriously, her brow furrowing in concentration. She took her time, as children should be allowed to do. Then she smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "I'll call you when I want to." Chris nodded, accepting the answer without relief or disappointment. Zara said nothing, but she didn't pull Sienna away. She didn't tighten her grip or redirect the moment. She simply stayed where she was, letting the scene unfold without interference. The sun dipped lower, stretching their shadows long across the grass, three distinct shapes, not merged, not separate enough to drift apart. There was no wedding promised, no dramatic reconciliation scripted for an audience, no vows spoken under arches or lights. What existed here was quieter and more fragile than that, and therefore more real. They had learned the cost of absolutes. They understood now that love did not always arrive wrapped in certainty. Some things could not be restored to what they once were. Trust, once broken, did not snap back into place. Time lost did not return. But something else had taken shape in the spaces left behind. Something built not on grand gestures, but on consistency, on showing up without guarantees, on choosing presence over power. Sienna ran again, circling back with breathless excitement, narrating a game only she fully understood. Zara listened, smiling softly, her hand brushing Chris's arm briefly as she stepped past him. Not an accident, not an invitation, simply a moment of shared balance. Chris felt it and did not reach for more. He had learned that some connections grew best when left unforced. They stayed until the light faded and the air cooled, until the park began to empty and the world shifted toward evening. When it was time to leave, Sienna slipped her hands into both of theirs without ceremony. As if this arrangement required no explanation, Zara allowed it. Chris accepted it carefully, reverently, as if holding something sacred and breakable. They walked back along the path together, steps in quiet rhythm. There was no promise of permanence spoken aloud, no declarations carved into stone, just an understanding, fragile and resilient at once. The future remained uncertain. There would be difficult conversations, boundaries renegotiated, moments of doubt and missteps yet to come. But for now, there was this: a shared afternoon, a child laughing, two adults choosing responsibility over redemption. The camera pulled back, the scene widening until they were small figures moving through the park, their shadows stretching ahead of them, three paths that had collided, diverged, and now ran alongside one another, not fused, not broken, different than before, stronger in quieter ways. The story did not end with certainty. It ended with something better, a beginning that did not need promises to hold.